Hello whisky fans, today I'm starting a series of videos on the Johnnie Walker range of whisky. But before I get into the actual whisky, I want to do this little video as a little introduction to the Johnnie Walker range and the history of the company. So this one's going to be a little bit of a long and rambly one, even by my standards. So if you're not interested in the history and you just want to get straight to the whisky, just skip to the first video in the series, Johnnie Walker Red, and I'll see you there. Well, there are two things that John Walker definitely wasn't, and one of them is a whisky fan, because Johnnie Walker was actually teetotal, believe it or not, so he made a point of never touching the hard stuff. And the other thing that John Walker wasn't, he was not the man that created the Johnnie Walker brand. It has been a very long process, and it's been passed down through multiple generations to get to the point where we are now. John Walker was a Scottish shopkeeper who, amongst lots of other things, was selling wine and spirits from his family shop by 1820. So one thing that we can say is that Johnnie Walker is incredibly old. And I'm not talking about the 18-year-old or any of the fancy Brawler and Port Ellen releases. Johnnie Walker as a brand is actually much older than a lot of Scottish distilleries. So at that time, whisky was a relatively small part of what the Walker family was selling out of their shop, but this all really changed in 1823. In the UK, we had the Excise Act of 1823, which, amongst other things, heavily reduced the levels of taxes that were payable on the sale of whisky and made whisky much more profitable. It's also worth mentioning that back then, whisky was very different to what we think of today. Single malts did exist, but they weren't really something that was easy to find. The majority of whisky back then would have been in the form of blended malts or grain whisky, and it was actually illegal to sell what we would now call blended Scotch back then. It wasn't permitted by law to blend one single malt with a grain whisky. So a lot of the whiskies were either blended malts or vatted malts or pure malts as they have been known in the past. So that's a mix of whiskies from several different single malt distilleries. Or the other popular whisky back in the day was grain whiskies. They would have been the sort of whiskies that John Walker would have sold in his shop. Now things all changed again when we had the Spirits Act of 1850, which legalised blended whisky. So from that point onwards it was possible to, or legal, to sell a whisky that had both single malt and grain whisky. And that really did a lot to popularise whisky at the time. Blended whisky was very well received because it was seen as a lighter, more palatable, more mass market appeal alternative. It was also at this point that Johnnie Walker started to sell whisky in the famous square bottles, and also at this point that he added the famous slanted label to the bottles. Skipping ahead to 1893, there's a major development in the Johnnie Walker brand in that they actually bought their own distillery, which was Cardew Single Malt Distillery, which still exists today, and I believe is still featured in a lot of the Johnnie Walker portfolio. So why would a family who is selling blended whisky invest in a single malt distillery? So the easy answer to that is that it guarantees a supply of quality single malt that you can put into those blends. So you're no longer restricted by the prices and supply levels that the single malt distilleries want to produce in and want to sell to you. You can control exactly what is going in, and if you need more, you can ramp up production. So things would really take off in 1906 when the Johnnie Walker range would really be invented in its infancy. In 1906, Johnnie Walker introduced the Old Highland blended whisky at 5 years old, the Special Old Highland at 9 years old, and the Extra Special Old Highland at 12 years old. And these would evolve again in 1909, where the Old Highland would become White Label 6-year-old, the Special Old Highland would become Red Label 10-year-old, and the Extra Special Old Highland 12-year-old would be reinvented as Black Label 12-year-old. In 1915, the Johnnie Walker brand would buy the Colburn distillery. In 1916, Clynelish, Dalywen and Talisker distilleries, and in 1923 they would add the Mortlach distillery. So already, nearly 100 years ago, and the Johnnie Walker brand has added some serious players from the single malt industry today to its portfolio. But back then, a lot of their whisky would never be seen as single malt at all, and this is something that a lot of distilleries don't really want to publicise. Back then, it really would have been blend fodder. A lot of those distilleries owe their current existence to the fact that they were making their wages by selling their single malt to be used in Johnnie Walker blends. In 1925 there was a serious change when the Johnnie Walker brand was merged or joined the Distillers Company Limited, or DCL. So there were a few other brands that were added to the Johnnie Walker portfolio over the years. In 1932 they introduced Johnnie Walker Swing, which some of you may be familiar with. It's bottled in a little bit of a gimmicky bottle which actually rocks. It has a slightly concave bottom. And jumping forward almost to modern day, in 1992 they introduced Johnnie Walker Blue, which is definitely not one of the most widely consumed of the Johnnie Walker range today, but it's definitely one of the most prestigious and well known. So in 1986 DCL was bought by the Guinness Company, the company behind the famous Dublin Stout. And in 1997 Guinness itself actually merged with a company called Grand Metropolitan to form a company that a lot of you will be familiar with today, which is Diageo. More on that later. So another couple of milestones from 1997. It was the year when Johnnie Walker introduced Johnnie Walker Green Label, which was originally a 15-year-old blended malt, so not blended Scotch, it's actually a blend of single malts. And also the same year that they introduced Johnnie Walker Gold, which also was originally an 18-year-old. In a bit of a bizarre turn of events, Johnnie Walker Gold would eventually lose its 18-year-old age statement, and a new whisky, Johnnie Walker Platinum, would be introduced, which in 2011 actually gained the 18-year-old age statement, and Johnnie Walker Green would eventually be discontinued and then brought back into the core range several years later, but without the 15-year-old age statement. So you really can't talk about Johnnie Walker blended Scotch without talking about Diageo. So as we mentioned before, Diageo was the company that resulted from the merger of Guinness and Grand Metropolitan, which is the company that today is behind an awful lot of single malt distilleries as well as blended Scotch labels. And Diageo tends not to have the best of reputations. It really does have this whole faceless mega corporation thing. A couple of the more well-known incidents that have really not done anything to improve the reputation of Diageo is in between 2003 and 2006, the Cardew distillery, which was the very first distillery purchased by the Johnnie Walker brand, Diageo for some reason decided they were going to change what was being sold under the Cardew name from a single malt to a blended malt. And to be fair to them, they did kind of make this clear on the label, but what really angered a lot of people was that they didn't go out of their way to change the packaging or the style at all. And a lot of people felt like Diageo were trying to pull a fast one there. Another even sadder incident in the Johnnie Walker history is in 2009, the company made the decision to close the original Kilmarnock site, which was where Johnnie Walker whiskies were traditionally always blended and bottled, and the associated Port Dundas grain distillery with a loss of 900 jobs. But enough about the negative. To Diageo's credit, they do operate more distilleries and whisky brands than any other group as far as I'm aware. So brands of blended whisky operated by Diageo, you have Johnnie Walker itself, Buchanan's, Dimple, Grand Old Pa, Hay Club, J&B, or just Rennie and Brooks, Vat 69 and White Horse. The list of single malt distilleries operated by Diageo includes Oathrusk, Benrinnes, Blair Athol, Kalila, Cameron Brigg, Cardew, Clynelish, Craigenmore, Dalhuin. You might have realised that I'm reading this off a list because there's no way that I can remember all of these. Dalwhinnie, Glen Elgin, Glen Spey, Glen Kinchy, Glen Lossie, Inchgower, Knockando, Lagavulin, Linkwood, Mannockmore, Mortlake, Oban, Royal Lochnagar, Strathmill, Talisker, Taninock, the Singleton of Dufftown, the Singleton of Glendullen, the Singleton of Glenord, and Valerie Singleton. So that's probably around a third of all the distilleries in Scotland, and knowing Diageo, they've probably constructed and opened another one in the time that I've been reading this list. And if you drink bourbon, that's not safe either, because Diageo also own the Bulleit Distillery. If you drink gin, then Gordon's is Diageo. If you drink rum, then Captain Morgan's is Diageo. And if you drink Archer's, Pimm's or Bailey's, then just stop. And if you're one of those people that are far too hip, trendy and edgy to drink any of those things that we've just mentioned, and your drink of choice is something like Ardbeg, I'll also remind you that Diageo owns 34% of Louis Vuitton Moët Hennessy, which is a company that owns Ardbeg. So if you drink Ardbeg, you're drinking Diageo too. Diageo also owns the Rose Isle Distillery, which has been rather unaffectionately dubbed Glenmordor. Rose Isle Distillery is a massive complex with a vast range of different stills of every shape and size, and the whole point of Rose Isle is it was created by Diageo to be able to produce almost any style of whisky in large volumes. As of yet, I don't believe we've had any whisky from Rose Isle actually released as a single malt, because Rose Isle really exists to create blend fodder for the Johnnie Walker range. And that really ties into the reason of why Diageo owns all of these distilleries. It wasn't originally because they wanted to sell single malt, it's because they want a guaranteed supply of all of the different single malts that they want. So they've got an enormous palette of single malts to put into their blends. But to be fair, it does work both ways, and a lot of these single malt distilleries may not exist today if it wasn't for Diageo putting their products into blends. You also have the other upside that if a single malt distillery has some particularly bad or uncharacteristic casks, they can dispose of those casks and make a little bit of money by allowing them to go into one of the blends where they perhaps won't be as noticed and won't do any damage to the more high prestige single malt brands. Another thing that you really have to give credit to Diageo for is the Flora and Fauna range. For anyone that doesn't know, the Flora and Fauna range is a presentation that's been around for a long time of Diageo whiskies from a lot of single malt distilleries that at the time that Flora and Fauna was introduced you didn't tend to see them on the shelves, and some of them were never actually bottled as single malt at all. So I really take my hat off to Diageo in that sense, that they're doing a lot to promote some of those unsung heroes. And yes, the Flora and Fauna range, I believe they're all bottled at 43%, which is okay, but could be better. And I think they probably are all chill filtered and probably all coloured. But still, it's nice that they're giving people the option to try these whiskies, which otherwise we'd never see. And of course, they produce the Johnnie Walker range of blended scotch itself. And that's what I'm going to be looking at in this series. So the Johnnie Walker products that I'm going to be reviewing are Johnnie Walker Red, Johnnie Walker Black, Johnnie Walker Green Label, Gold, Platinum and Blue. So the ones that I'm going to be leaving out is the Johnnie Walker White Walker Game of Thrones tie-in, the Double Black, and also the Johnnie Walker Ghost and Rare range, which may be good whiskies and they might come another day. But at the moment I'm going to concentrate on that core range beginning with Red Label. See you there.